The Quarterly, the Gospel of Mark. Lesson 13. Mark 15, 1-39 and 16, 1-8. The trial, death, and resurrection of the Son of God. Mark's Gospel climaxes with the death and resurrection of Jesus, which took place exactly as he had prophesied. Mark makes it clear that Jesus was arrested on trumped-up charges, tried in a biased court, crucified for no good reason, all of which led up to him dying what would normally have been regarded as a shameful criminal's death. Yet for Mark, there was no shame in the cross, because it was the means by which Jesus atoned for our sins. Mark 10:45. Nor was this the end of the story of Jesus, as death is the final chapter in most of our earthly stories. The original enigmatic text of chapter 16 leaves readers on a cliffhanger, challenging them to make up their own minds as to the outcome in verse 8, though Mark's own view is not in doubt. The centurion's testimony, "Truly this man was the Son of God," in verse 39, echoes Mark's opening statement, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in chapter 1, verse 1, providing a neat inclusio. It's astonishing that the Son of God could die, but far more unthinkable that he should stay dead, especially after prophesying his own resurrection. Jesus' trial before the Jewish authorities took place in the middle of the night at the high priest's house, Mark 14:53-65, even though, according to the Sanhedrin's own rules, it was unlawful for them to conduct proceedings at that hour. But the Jewish authorities had no power to condemn Jesus to death. For that sentence, they needed the help of the Roman governor, Pilate. The charge of blasphemy, which the Sanhedrin deliberated, was not a crime under Roman law. Rather, they needed to make it appear that Jesus was a threat to Roman power. Hence, in contrast to the high priest question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" in 1461, Pilate's initial question to Jesus was, "Are you the King of the Jews?" chapter 15, verse 2. The Jewish authorities also laid many other unsubstantiated charges against Jesus. But to Pilate's surprise, Jesus made no answer. Verse 4. Even with Jesus making no defense, Pilate could clearly see that the charges had been trumped up by the Jewish authorities. Verse 10. Yet he had no wish to make enemies out of the Jewish leaders. Pilate would have been aware of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem a week earlier, and likely thought that the crowd would step in to save their hero, leaving Pilate free from responsibility for the decision. As a result, Pilate proposed that the crowd should choose between Jesus and Barabbas, a convicted terrorist, to determine the person who would be freed from custody in celebration of the Passover feast, verses 6 and 7. However, the Jewish authorities turned the crowd against Jesus, having them cry out for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be crucified, verses 11-13. Ironically, their response clearly disproved the claim of the Jewish authorities that Jesus was about to declare himself the King of the Jews. No one in this crowd seemed to want this man to be their king. And when Pilate responded, "Why? What evil has he done?" the crowd only cried louder for Jesus to be crucified. Verse 14. Unwilling to risk causing a riot, Pilate determined to scourge and then crucify Jesus. Verse 15. Without establishing any valid charges against him, as was required by Roman law. Along with being turned over to the Gentiles and scourged, Jesus had also predicted that before they killed him, the Gentiles would mock him. Mark 10:33-34. These predictions are fulfilled in all of their painful details. Because Jesus had been charged with proclaiming to be the King of the Jews, the Roman soldiers dressed him royally in a cloak of purple material, most probably a soldier's red cloak, since a real purple cloak would have been too expensive, and with a crown that had been manufactured out of thorns, in painful imitation of Caesar's wreath of laurel leaves, verse 17. They also verbally abused him, with some saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and bowing down to him, while others struck him on the head with a wooden cane and spat on him, a universal gesture of contempt. See Isaiah 50, verse 6. As a further insult, the sign on the cross over Jesus' head read, "The King of the Jews," and he was enthroned in the midst of two criminals as his courtiers, verses 26 and 27. The Jewish authorities continued to hurl insults at him, recalling his prediction that he would destroy the temple and build it up again in 3 days, Mark 14:58, without realizing that Jesus was in the process of fulfilling that precise prophecy through his own crucifixion and resurrection. See John 2:21-22. Meanwhile, the chief priests and scribes said, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself." Verse 31. Again, words that were intended to wound turned out to be truer than they knew. Jesus could not save himself from the cross if he was indeed to save his people from their sins. After 3 hours of mockery on the cross, at the 6th hour, at noon, the sky grew dark over the whole land for 3 hours. The burden of all the sins of Jesus' people separated the sun from the light of his Father's countenance, which had hitherto shone upon him constantly in blessing, just as the Aaronic blessing promised in Numbers 6, verses 22-27. And Jesus cried out in Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The cry of David from Psalm 22:1. The strength of voice that Mark notes demonstrates that this was no ordinary crucifixion, in which the victim slowly lapses into unconsciousness. Jesus remained strong until he chose to breathe his last. Indeed, this shout may be the final breath that Jesus takes in verse 37, a breath so powerful that as Jesus' spirit exits his body, so too the curtain in the Jerusalem temple, protecting the divine presence in the Holy of Holies, was torn in two from top to bottom, allowing the departure of God's presence from that location. Verse 38. Those who watched Jesus' death had mixed reactions. Some misunderstood his cry and thought he was summoning Elijah. Verse 39. These were likely Jewish observers who saw what happened without understanding. But a Roman centurion, a Gentile, understood it truly when he cried out, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Verse 39. Mark's account of the resurrection is the briefest and most enigmatic of all the Gospels. The oldest manuscripts stop at verse 8, and most scholars think that verses 9-20 are a later addition, albeit from very early in the history of transmission. This later ending reads like a brief summary of the other Gospel narratives, along with a sermonic exhortation to the audience in verses 16-18 that is different in style from the rest of Mark. Mark's obsession with showing Jesus fulfilling his own predictions might lead us to expect a detailed account of the resurrection. But instead, it seems that his conclusion was focused on people's reactions to the death and resurrection of Jesus. We already saw the contrast between those who interpreted Jesus' death cry as a final appeal to Elijah and the centurion who truly grasped what was happening. And now Mark's attention shifts to the burial of Jesus in a clearly identifiable tomb, belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, verses 46 to 47. The same women who saw him buried were the first witnesses of the resurrection on the morning after the Sabbath, as they went to anoint the body with spices. Chapter 16, verse 1. This detail shows that they had no expectation of the resurrection. But the evidence was irrefutable. The large stone that the woman would not have been able to move had been rolled away. And in the tomb they saw an angelic figure who announced the resurrection to them. Verses 5 and 6. Even though women were not allowed to present testimony in ancient courts, the angel told them to go as witnesses and tell the other disciples, especially Peter, that the risen Jesus had gone ahead of them to Galilee, just as he said. See 14:28. There the disciples would see him with their own eyes, the ultimate proof that he had risen just as he said. But the women were afraid, and they fled out of fear. Verse 8. The other Gospels fill in more details, as does the longer ending. Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden near the tomb. John 20, verse 11. The women did eventually tell the other disciples. Matthew 28:8. But the shorter ending has its own integrity. By leaving us on the negative response of the women, it demonstrates that the resurrection was not a wish fulfillment vision, but a real and terrifying experience that the disciples at first struggled to make sense out of. And Mark thus asks his readers, what do you make of this claim that Jesus has risen as he said? Are you willing to believe its truth and to submit to the claims of the risen Christ? Or will you remain forever trapped in fear and unbelief? Application questions. You might think that everyone would love a sinless person. Why were the Jewish authorities and the crowd so angry at Jesus? 2. What aspects of Jesus' death were important? 3. Why is the bodily resurrection of Jesus vitally important to the Christian faith? 4. What have you learned from this study in Mark's Gospel? How would you summarize its message briefly to other people?